We now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here is Reverend Martin.
Thank you, Brother Blackwell. This is Pastor Nathaniel W Martin, pastor of the New Life Institutional Baptist Church here in Los Angeles, Southern California. I'm very grateful to have this moment of time to spend with you, dealing with the world history, American history, with an emphasis this month of February on Black history and the accomplishments of our people, not only in America, but all over the world, really, as we take the blinders off and no longer look through the prism of racism and walk away from the ignorance of the past to see civilization as it is and not as it has been spoon-fed or taught to us in many of our public and college, university settings. We take our marching orders from the Bible, very grounded in the Bible, because the Bible teaches social justice, social equality. Those who have taught us about the social gospel have rooted themselves in the history of the Holy and Sacred Writ. Indeed, those that espouse the inferiority of one people as opposed to another, especially the European and the American so-called white race, although we know now that there is no biological reality to race. You go back and look at the O.J. Simpson trial, you never hear Marcia Clark ask the question, what race was in that DNA that they found, because they were smart enough to know that race is not a factor in reality or in biology. That's why our young people's organs are being harvested after they pass or die or whatever, or killed. And because those organs can be sold and can be transplanted into any person who has that blood type and is a match, because race is not a biological reality in the genetic pool or in the mitochondrial DNA. But I'm already getting ahead of myself. Let us look to the Bible. The Bible says in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 14, "Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether they be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates, at their day." I always put emphasis on that, because you have let me finish reading first. "At thy day thou shalt give them their hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for they are poor, and set their hearts upon it, lest they cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee." I have a tendency to begin commentary before I finish reading. But the point I was going to make, at their day, that means when they finish their work, when they finish their agreed upon contracted obligation, you are to do what? Not withhold their pay or their money or their salary or their just due or their revenue, but you ought to be certain that you observe and honor your obligation, because as the Bible says, they are poor and needy. And we used to have a saying around here, "I'm the poorest, I need the most." And if you owe me, you need to pay me, because I need my money. I can't go down to Ralph's with empty hands. I got to go to Ralph's with what it takes to come through that checkout stand. Somebody ought to say amen. Give them their hire. Don't hold it. Don't tell them to come back tomorrow or next week. Pay them on the agreed upon amount at the agreed upon moment in time. That means when they get through working and come up to wherever the house or the pay window in business, in these corporations and these companies, you pay them what you owe them. And that brings us to reparations for black people for past misdeeds in the government of these United States of America. Because as Dr. King said, America has given the Negro a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. And as he got ready for the Poor People's Campaign, Dr. King said in one of those sermons of his, is even on YouTube online, said, when we go to Washington this time, we're going to get our check. We must have, it is mandatory, it is imperative in order for the guilt of past years, generations, decades, and indeed centuries to be atoned for. We need to petition the government, and the government of the United States of America needs to, in turn, honor the lawful petition of the people for reparations for past misdeeds. Some folk dealing with the slavery issue, how that for 250 years, Abraham Lincoln says, the bondsman's unrequited toil. And I always pick it up from even after 1900, during the time and when the country was beginning to develop the suburbs. Then you had World War I. Later on you had World War II, and in all of those wars, the African American fought, the American Negro fought, the colored man fought for his country. And yet when he came home, he received the same bad check, the same bad treatment. And a lot of that was governmental treatment. The government endorsed, government assented to. It was not private. You look at the businesses, they say we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Yes, that is a private a statement, but they cannot publicly enforce it because they just can't tell you, well, you're black, you can't come in here, because that's against the law, first of all. All right? So the government of the United States of America has really issued, as Dr. King said, given the Negro a bad check. It was bad when the land was being given away freely across the West. It was white only, naturally, because, first of all, Negroes were still in slavery, so you won't give no slave no land. But then even after that, the land grants did not go equally, as it were, but it was a bias that was applied, a prejudice, and that indulged the bigotry of the one group of people against their brothers and sisters who had been kissed by the sun, as we euphemistically make the case. The point is that the laws were written to benefit one culture, but not the other culture. Notice I use the word culture, not the word race, because race is a concept, only an idea. It has no bases in reality. I'm trying to get away from the use of the word race, but we must reference the standard or the background against which the discrimination And the segregation of the country occurred. It occurred because one group believed that they were superior, that was white supremacy, and were teaching and were trying to compel the other group to believe that they were inferior, where they were trying to teach white supremacy, which means that the other opposite of that was black inferiority. And that was codified in legislation and in statutes, and indeed in the lending practices, the underwriting practices of the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. There is a video out, The Power of a Race, The Power of an Illusion, which I would encourage all of you to download and look at it. So many parts of it are up on YouTube, and you can get the entire series from the U.S. Newsreel Company and look at it for yourself. And it was appalling how black people were excluded from the suburbs, as they say. And that has always given the one culture a head start, because if you don't have nowhere to stay, and I'm not going to give you nowhere to stay, and I'm not going to help you buy no house, but I'm going to give this other person somewhere to stay and help them buy the house and underwrite the loan and supply the insurance, then quite naturally that other person is going to be so much more economically advanced than you, because they got a better start. And that is what we need to petition the United States government about, specifically, not only for slavery, but for that 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, in which the black man was shut out of the suburbs, shut out of the middle class, irrespective of the fact that there may be some few exceptions to the rule who were doing good, like the Delaney's and like that. We don't know how they got that. But we do know that for the mass of black people, there was no suburbs, there was no housing. It wasn't the suburbs, it was Nicholson Garden, the Pueblo del Rio, Jordan Downs, Hawaiian Gardens, and like that. And that's just right here in Los Angeles. That thing spread, that was all across the country. Chicago, it was Cabrini Green and all like that. All those places where they talk about the ghetto, those ghettos were developed by government policy, government acts. Government legislation that pushed our people into overcrowded, overpopulated, poorly maintained ghettos and slums, while the other group received the benefits of the wide open single family dwelling unit that came with a Bendix washer and a refrigerator and a stove. And it is really appalling how this country has treated its citizens here in America. Now, as we say, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in order to remedy the lack of any notation or recognition of the achievements and the accomplishments of black people in history, started what they called Negro History Week way back there, around 1926, like that. And I used to sell, when I came along here in Los Angeles, he had a 24-volume Negro Life and History, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Negro History Library. I used to sell that. And the purpose of that was to let our people know that we really did make some contribution, even here in America, let alone all over the world. And when you began to pull back and get out from under the prism of ignorance that white supremacy has spread across the face of the world for the last 500 years, then you began to see that a lot of those biblical characters, but the majority of the biblical civilization and peoples and nations and tongues were black, because civilization actually began not in Europe. It began in Africa. That's where the Garden of Eden was. But I'm digressing. I'm trying to get to the point of black history observance and why it's important. We started out as Negro History Week so we can tell our people something about our existence. Then later on in some years, I guess after the 50s or 60s, we began to have black studies at the colleges, and we say, well, we need more than just a week to talk about us. We need to talk about us for a month. And really, we need to talk about it every day because our people are steady being brainwashed. While the immigrant comes here, he's brainwashed. You go talk to people, immigrants, and even they have ingested that white supremacy bias. And so we need to talk about black history. We need to talk about the accomplishments of our people and discuss our worth and discuss our achievement. Remember, it was not that long ago, 1936 Olympics, as Hitler was getting ready for his invasion and to take over the world, as it were, that he was teaching the Nazi doctrine of the superiority of the Aryan race. And mind you, much of that doctrine that formed Nazism was developed and born right here in the United States of America. You go up to California Institute of Technology and go down in that basement, the records of the Human Betterment Foundation, which was one of the branches of the eugenics movement, which was a pseudoscience that accepted the teaching of social Darwinism and talked about and promoted the inferiority races. Matter of fact, one of the writers of that doctrine that was well accepted during those years was a Dr. Frederick Hoffman. And he was a member of the American Economic Association. And more importantly, he was a statistician for the Prudential Life Insurance Company. And he wrote a book entitled The Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negroes. And the thesis and the main proposition of the book was the extinction of the Negro is encoded in his blood because it said the Negro was weak and inferior. And in a few years, he was going to become extinct. Well, that type of thinking was accepted science because you must remember that scientists were products of their culture. And just like the religion was teaching the inferiority races, so likewise the science was attempting to propagate or confirm the inferiority of one race and the superiority of the other race. Remember, it was under an American named Alexander Stephens during the Confederacy, during the war, to sustain and promote slavery here in the United States of America, that the Constitution of the Confederacy said that the foundation is laid and the cornerstone rests upon the inferiority, the fact of the inferiority of the African or the Negro to the white man, and that slavery is his normal and natural and accepted condition. That was the Confederate Constitution, under which they were willing to rip up, as Abraham Lincoln said, the government of the United States and replace it with a slave government. Rip up the freedom government and replace it with a slave government. But I get away from my point. Point being that in 1936 Olympics, when Adolf Hitler wanted to showcase and parade and exhibit the superiority of the Aryan race there for the world to see, was going to be on display. And lo and behold, 3 Negroes, well, more than 3. You had like Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalf, Mike Robinson, who was brother of Jackie Robinson, John Woodruff, Archie Franklin. All of those names are in history, but they were all there in 1936 competing in that Olympics against the best in the world. Remember, you can't have the best, say you're the best in the world, so you compete against the best in the world. And the people in Germany had not competed against people from Africa. They had not competed against people from the United States of America. They had not competed against themselves. And so naturally they were limited in their ability and in their knowledge. And but when they came to the 1936 Olympics, Hitler was very much chagrined and quite nonplussed when Jesse Owens won 4, not just 1, but 4 gold medals. He won in the 100 meter, he won in the 200 meter, he won in the long jump, and he won in the 400 relay along with his compatriots. Like I said, Jesse Owens came in 1, Ralph Metcalf came in number 2, Mike Robinson came in like 1, 2, 3. That's where they come. And so this was very shameful and humiliating and embarrassing to the Nazis and to the Nazi propaganda and to the Nazi proposition that they were propounding at that time of the superiority of the Aryan race and the inferiority, quite naturally, of the African race. So quite naturally, Hitler wouldn't shake none of the black fellas' hands, but that didn't matter. The history book says Jesse Owens won, Ralph Metcalf won silver. Let's see, Jesse Owens came in 10.3. Ralph Metcalf right behind him, 10.4. And then there was a white boy from Holland who came in 10.5, and that's in the 100 meters. Then you had a black boy named John Woodruff who won gold in the 800 meters, that same 1936 Olympics. Archie Franklin, another black boy, he won gold in the 400 meters, 1936 Olympics. And so when the Olympics was over, let's digress, get lost here. And quite naturally, they began to scratch their heads well, now, what is all of these statistics that we have about the inferiority of the black man, or the inferiority of the Negro, as they would call universally at that time? And so that was an American who was the team coach for the American team. And he made the observation that the Negro excels in athletics because, in his estimation, remember, this is false science, but it's what they were teaching at the time. He is closer to the primitive. It was not so long ago that their ability to sprint and jump was a life and death matter to him in the jungle. But what he fails to recognize, because they were ignorant at the time anyway, was that if civilization started in Africa, and as the scientists have subsequently proven, then it spread out through the geography in the generations subsequent, geographically all over the world, and even into the Caucasus and into Europe. And so that, in other words, that would put the European closer to the primeval or primitive than it would put the African, because as you got further away, then quite naturally the closest people to the primitive would really have been the European and not the African, because the African had developed the civilizations of what the Greeks, after they conquered, renamed Africa Egypt, or the Mediterranean. But really, all of that is a part of the one continent of Africa. And so a lot of ignorance is being taught in our schools and in our geographical books. And we're still laboring to get out from under those false concepts, those false propositions, those false assumptions and presumptions. And don't look like we're going to get out from under it in my 5 minutes, Doc? All right, in my lifetime. But I trust that we can agree that we really need to be better educated in our universities, in our colleges, and yes, in our elementary schools. I had put down some quotes here from Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who is the father, that we say, of Negro History Week. It says, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. So what is he saying? He's saying that if one culture controls the other culture's thinking, then that other culture would always be what? Inferior. Not because they are biologically inferior or physically inferior, but because they have been conditioned and brainwashed to that state. And so another one is Dr. Carter G. Woodson's statement is, if a race has no history, let me read this word for word. If a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. And that was one of the problems with the lack of teaching or the lack of presence in the history books here in the United States, and yes, in much of the world, in much of the European world. And remember, the world has been under European domination or American domination since 1492 and before. And so these lies have spread, and these myths have spread, and they have been maintained. But we must rise up. We must wake up. I've got to remember the man said I only had 5 more minutes. And let me wrap up here by encouraging you to continue your study of history, U.S. history, American history, black history, devoid of these concepts of race. And as we always say, if working hard would make you rich, then every slave coming out of slavery would have been a millionaire. Remember, you can't work for free. You got to get paid. If they don't want to pay you, my brothers and my sisters, no matter how much they talk about how much they appreciate you, if they don't want to pay you, don't work for them. God bless you. Thank you, Doc.